The fine was taped to my garage door when I got home from work, and I knew immediately this was going to be a problem. I peeled the yellow notice off and read it twice, then a third time just to make sure I was understanding correctly. According to the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, I was being fined $300 for excessive noise disturbance resulting from improper equipment storage. The citation specifically mentioned my air compressor and power tools, claiming they violated the community's noise ordinance between the hours of 7 in the morning and 9 at night. The thing is, I had barely used any of my equipment that week. I am a mechanical engineer who occasionally does woodworking projects on weekends. And yes, I have an air compressor in my garage. But I had been swamped with work lately and had not touched any of my tools in at least 2 weeks. The air compressor had been sitting silent in the corner of my garage, not making a single sound. I walked into my house in Phoenix, Arizona, threw my keys on the kitchen counter, and immediately called the HOA office. A woman with a nasal voice answered after 4 rings. Meadowbrook Estates HOA, this is Brenda speaking. Hi Brenda, this is Ryan Larson from 4782 Desert View Lane. I just got a noise violation notice and I think there has been some kind of mistake. There was a pause, then the sound of typing. Let me pull up your file. Ah yes, Mr. Larson. The complaint was filed by our board president, Patricia Vanderhoff. She personally documented the noise disturbance on 3 separate occasions this week. That does not make any sense. I have not used my equipment in weeks. What exactly did she hear? More typing. According to the report, she documented excessive mechanical noise coming from your garage on Monday afternoon, Wednesday morning, and Friday evening. The noise was described as loud mechanical humming and compressed air sounds. I felt my jaw tighten. My garage door has been closed all week. The compressor was not even plugged in. Be that as it may, Mr. Larson, the fine stands unless you can provide evidence to dispute the claim. You have 14 days to either pay or file an appeal. Have a nice evening. She hung up before I could respond. I stood there holding my phone, anger bubbling up in my chest. This was not the first time Patricia Vanderhoff had targeted me. 6 months ago, she had tried to fine me for parking my work truck in my own driveway, claiming it was a commercial vehicle and violated HOA rules. I had fought that 1-on-1 after pointing out that half the neighborhood had trucks that could be classified as commercial vehicles. She had not been happy about that. The next morning was Saturday, and I decided to pay Patricia a visit. She lived 4 houses down from me in a beige stucco house with an immaculate lawn and seasonal decorations that she changed religiously every month. Currently, her porch featured an elaborate spring display with oversized ceramic rabbits and flower arrangements. I rang the doorbell and waited. Patricia answered wearing a pink velour tracksuit and oversized sunglasses pushed up on her bleached blonde hair. She was probably in her late 40s, with the kind of sharp features that looked permanently pursed in disapproval. Ryan, she said, not bothering to hide her annoyance. What can I do for you? We need to talk about this noise violation. She crossed her arms. There is nothing to discuss. You violated the noise ordinance and the fine is appropriate. Patricia, I have not used my equipment in weeks. Whatever you heard, it was not coming from my garage. I know what I heard, she said firmly. I was walking my dog past your house on 3 separate occasions, and each time there was loud mechanical noise coming from your property. It was disruptive and unacceptable. Can we at least look at my garage together? I can show you that nothing has been running. She shook her head. That would not prove anything. You could have turned everything off since then. The fine stands, Ryan. If you do not like it, file an appeal, but I should warn you that as board president, I have full authority over noise complaints, and my decision is final in these matters. I felt my hands ball into fists at my sides, but I kept my voice level. This is harassment, Patricia. You have been looking for ways to find me ever since I challenged you on the truck situation. Her expression hardened. Are you accusing me of something? Because that sounds like defamation, and I could add that to your violations. You know what? Forget it. I will file the appeal. I turned and walked away before I said something I would regret. Back at my house, I did some research on the Meadowbrook Estates HOA bylaws and Arizona HOA regulations. According to our community rules, noise complaints required objective measurement, not just subjective observation. The bylaws specifically stated that noise violations must exceed 65 decibels during daytime hours and 55 decibels during evening hours when measured from the property line. Patricia had not included any decibel measurements in her complaint. She had just claimed there was noise. That was my opening. I spent the next few hours researching sound level meters and found a professional-grade decibel meter available for rent from a local equipment supply company. On Monday morning, I took a half-day off work and drove to the rental place in Tempe to pick it up. The device was a Extec 407780A, a Class II sound level meter that met ANSI standards. The guy at the rental shop showed me how to calibrate it and explained the different measurement settings. You want a weighting for environmental noise, he said. That is what most noise ordinances are based on. And make sure you take multiple readings at different times to establish a pattern. I spent Monday evening taking baseline readings around my property with all my equipment turned off. The ambient noise level in my garage with everything silent was about 42 decibels. Outside, near the property line closest to Patricia's house, the ambient level was around 48 decibels, mostly from traffic on the main road and the occasional airplane overhead. Tuesday morning, I set up a simple test. I ran my air compressor for exactly 5 minutes while taking continuous measurements from various points around my property. The compressor, a relatively quiet California Air Tools model I had specifically chosen for its low noise output, registered at 68 decibels from inside the garage with the door closed. At my property line, it measured 54 decibels. At the property line closest to Patricia's house, it dropped to 51 decibels, well below the 65 decibel daytime threshold. I documented everything with photos and video, showing the meter readings along with time stamps. But as I was finishing up, something else caught my attention. I heard a loud mechanical roar coming from the other side of the fence that separated the backyards. It was Tuesday morning, 10 o'clock, and the HOA's landscaping crew had arrived. I grabbed the sound level meter and walked to my back fence. The noise was coming from industrial-grade lawn mowers, leaf blowers, and edgers that the landscaping company used to maintain the common areas and the homes that paid for the HOA's premium landscape service. I held the meter up at my property line, and the reading jumped to 88 decibels. I moved to the side of my house facing the street, where the crew was now using a leaf blower on the sidewalk, and the reading hit 92 decibels. That gave me an idea. I spent the next hour following the landscaping crew around the neighborhood, always staying on public sidewalks or my own property, taking measurements at property lines wherever they worked. The results were consistent. The lawn mowers ranged from 85 to 95 decibels at property lines. The leaf blowers were even worse, hitting 98 decibels when they were being used near homes. The edgers and trimmers ranged from 82 to 87 decibels. Every single piece of equipment, the HOA hired landscaping crew used exceeded the noise ordinance that Patricia was trying to enforce against me. And they operated from 8 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon, 3 days a week, throughout the neighborhood. I went home and organized all my data into a comprehensive report. I included photos of the sound level meter with visible readings, timestamps, GPS coordinates from my phone showing exactly where each measurement was taken, and a detailed comparison chart. My air compressor at 51 decibels at the nearest property line versus the HOA's lawnmowers at an average of 89 decibels at property lines throughout the neighborhood. On Wednesday, I submitted my formal appeal to the HOA board, including my complete report and a demand that the fine be dismissed. I also included a pointed question about whether the HOA planned to fine itself for violating its own noise ordinance on a regular basis. Brenda from the HOA office called me on Thursday afternoon. "Mr. Larson, I have received your appeal. The board will review it at next month's meeting." Next month? The fine is due in 10 days. That is correct. If you do not pay by the due date, there will be additional late fees. However, if your appeal is successful, any fees paid will be refunded. So, I either pay a fine I should not owe or risk accumulating more fees. That does not seem fair. Those are the procedures, Mr. Larson. I do not make the rules. She hung up. I was not going to wait a month. I pulled up the HOA bylaws again and found the section on emergency board meetings. According to the rules, any homeowner could request an emergency meeting if they could get signatures from at least 10% of the community's residents. Meadowbrook Estates had 240 homes, so I needed 24 signatures. I spent that evening and the entire weekend going door to door. I brought my report with me, showing neighbors the noise level comparisons. The response was overwhelming. People were tired of Patricia's heavy-handed enforcement and the constant fines for minor infractions. Many had their own stories about unfair penalties and selective rule enforcement. "She fined me $100 because my trash can was visible from the street," one neighbor, Tom, told me. "I had brought it in from the curb and left it beside my garage for literally 20 minutes while I helped my wife unload groceries." 20 minutes, and she happened to drive by and documented it. Another neighbor, Maria, shook her head in disgust. "She tried to fine us because our daughter's basketball hoop was 6 inches over the property line into the easement. 6 inches. My husband had to dig it up and move it, and we still got a fine for the violation before we corrected it. By Sunday evening, I had 43 signatures. More than enough. On Monday morning, I submitted the petition for an emergency board meeting along with my appeal documents. The bylaws required the board to schedule the meeting within 10 days of receiving a valid petition. Brenda called me that afternoon, her voice considerably less friendly than usual. "Mr. Larson, I have received your petition. The board will convene an emergency meeting this Thursday evening at 7 p.m. in the community center. You will have 15 minutes to present your case." "Thank you, Brenda. I should warn you, Patricia is not happy about this. She considers it a waste of the board's time." "I am sure she does." Thursday evening arrived, and I showed up at the community center with my laptop, printed copies of my report, and a bad feeling in my gut. The community center was a small building near the neighborhood entrance, with a meeting room that could hold about 50 people. I was surprised to find it nearly full when I arrived. Word had spread about the meeting, and it seemed like half the neighborhood had shown up. The board sat at a long table at the front of the room. Patricia was in the center, flanked by 4 other board members. 2 men and 2 women I recognized from around the neighborhood but had never formally met. Patricia looked furious, her lips pressed into a thin line as she glared at me. "Let us get this started," Patricia said sharply, banging a gavel on the table. "We are here because Mr. Ryan Larson has petitioned for an emergency meeting to appeal a noise violation fine. Mr. Larson, you have 15 minutes. Make it count." I stood up and walked to the front of the room, connecting my laptop to the projector. "Thank you for taking the time to hear my appeal. I will keep this brief and stick to the facts." I pulled up my presentation, starting with the fine I had received. On March 15th, I received a citation for excessive noise disturbance, allegedly from my air compressor and power tools. The fine was $300. According to the citation, Patricia personally documented noise from my property on 3 occasions. However, I had not used any of my equipment during the time period in question. Patricia leaned forward. "Are you calling me a liar?" "I am saying there is a discrepancy that needs to be addressed." In order to verify the actual noise levels from my property, I rented a calibrated, professional-grade sound level meter that meets ANSI standards. I then conducted a series of measurements to establish the facts. I clicked to the next slide, showing photos of my equipment and the corresponding decibel readings. My air compressor, when running at full operation with my garage door closed, measures 51 decibels at the nearest property line. The Meadowbrook Estates bylaws state that daytime noise cannot exceed 65 decibels at the property line. As you can see, my equipment is well below that threshold. One of the board members, a man named Richard, raised his hand. "But you said you were not using your equipment during the time of the complaint. How do we know it was not louder on those specific days?" "That is a fair question. I cannot prove what happened on days I was not measuring. What I can prove is the maximum noise level my equipment can produce under full operation. Unless someone broke into my garage and somehow made my equipment louder than its design specifications, these measurements represent the worst-case scenario." I clicked to the next section of slides. However, in the process of taking these measurements, I discovered something interesting. The HOA's own landscaping crew operates equipment throughout the neighborhood 3 days a week. I took measurements of their equipment at property lines throughout Meadowbrook Estates, following all proper measurement protocols. The room went silent as I displayed the comparison chart. My compressor at 51 decibels versus the HOA mowers at 85 to 95 decibels, leaf blowers at 92 to 98 decibels, and edgers at 82 to 87 decibels. As you can see, the equipment that the HOA operates and authorizes in our neighborhood is significantly louder than my personal equipment. In fact, it exceeds the noise ordinance on every single measurement. The HOA's leaf blowers are nearly twice as loud as the permitted level. Patricia's face had turned red. "That is completely different. Landscaping is necessary maintenance." "I agree that landscaping is necessary," I said calmly. "But the bylaws do not make an exception for necessary maintenance. The noise ordinance applies to all noise sources within the community. If you are going to enforce it against homeowners, it should be enforced consistently." Another board member, a woman named Susan, looked troubled. "Patricia, did you actually take decibel measurements when you filed this complaint against Mr. Larson?" "I did not need to," Patricia snapped. "The noise was obvious. I know a violation when I hear one." "But the bylaws require objective measurement," Susan said, flipping through a copy of the rules. "It says right here, noise complaints must be verified by measurement before a fine can be issued." Patricia's jaw tightened. "I have been board president for 6 years. I know how to identify violations." I decided to press further. "I would also like to point out that this is not the first time Patricia has filed questionable complaints against me. 6 months ago, She tried to fine me for parking my work truck in my driveway, despite the fact that similar vehicles are parked in driveways throughout the neighborhood. That complaint was dismissed. Now I am being fined for noise violations that apparently do not require actual measurement, while the HOA operates equipment that is demonstrably louder than anything I own. A man in the audience stood up. "I would like to say something if I may." Patricia looked annoyed but nodded. "Make it quick, Tom." Tom, the neighbor who had told me about his trash can fine, stepped forward. "Patricia, with all due respect, a lot of us feel like the enforcement in this neighborhood has become excessive and selective. Ryan is not the only one who has been fined for minor issues while larger problems get ignored. My wife and I were fined for a trash can that was out for less than half an hour. Meanwhile, the house on Cactus Drive has had a broken fence for 6 months, and nothing has been done about it." Several other people in the audience murmured in agreement. A woman stood up. "I got fined because my mailbox had a small dent in it. Not missing, not fallen over, just a dent. $50. Patricia banged her gavel. "This meeting is about Mr. Larson's appeal, not general grievances." Richard, the board member, held up his hand. "Actually, Patricia, I think this is relevant. If there is a pattern of inconsistent enforcement, we need to address it. And Susan is right about the bylaws. Noise complaints do require measurement. We cannot fine someone based on subjective judgment." Patricia stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I am the president of this board. I have dedicated 6 years to keeping this community up to standard. These rules exist for a reason, and if we do not enforce them, this neighborhood will fall apart." "No one is questioning your dedication," Susan said carefully, "but we have to follow our own rules. Based on what Ryan has presented, his equipment does not violate the noise ordinance, and if we are going to enforce noise rules, we need to address the landscaping issue too." "The landscaping crew is contracted and licensed," Patricia argued. "They are professionals." "That does not make them exempt from the noise ordinance," I said. "Either the rule applies to everyone or it does not apply at all." The board members looked at each other. Finally, Richard spoke. "I move that we dismiss the fine against Mr. Larson due to lack of proper measurement and evidence. Furthermore, I move that we require all future noise complaints to include documented decibel measurements before any fines are issued." "I second that motion," Susan said immediately. Patricia looked like she wanted to argue, but the other 2 board members nodded in agreement. The vote was 4-1, with Patricia being the only dissenting vote. "The motion passes," Richard said. "Ryan, your fine is dismissed. Patricia, going forward, please make sure all noise complaints include proper documentation." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. "Thank you. I appreciate the board's time." As people started filing out of the meeting, several neighbors came up to thank me and shake my hand. Tom clapped me on the shoulder. "You might have just made life better for all of us." Patricia needed someone to stand up to her. But Patricia was not done. As I was packing up my laptop, she stormed over. "You think you are so clever, do not you? You made me look like a fool in front of the entire board." "I just presented the facts," I said evenly. "This is not over, Ryan. I will be watching your property very carefully from now on. One violation, one single violation, and I will make sure you regret this." "Is that a threat?" "It is a promise." She turned and stalked out of the community center. I drove home feeling victorious but uneasy. Patricia had made it clear she was going to target me, and I knew from her history that she was not above bending rules to get what she wanted. For the next 2 weeks, everything was quiet. I kept careful track of my property, making sure everything was in perfect compliance. My grass was mowed to the exact height specified in the bylaws. My trash cans were in my garage except for collection day, and even then, I brought them in within an hour of pickup. My car was washed regularly to avoid any appearance of disrepair. But then, I noticed something odd. On a Thursday afternoon, I came home from work to find a new fine taped to my door. This time, it was for unapproved exterior modifications. According to the citation, I had painted my front door without HOA approval, which required submission of color samples and board permission before any exterior changes. The problem was, I had not painted my door. It was the same color it had been since I moved in 3 years ago. I called the HOA office immediately. "Brenda, I got another fine from Patricia. She is claiming I painted my front door, but I did not. Let me look at the file." There was a pause. "According to Patricia's notes, your door was originally beige and now it is brown. It has always been brown." "I have never painted it." "You have proof of that?" I thought for a moment. "Actually, yes. I have photos from when I listed and sold my old condo 3 years ago. The real estate agent took exterior photos of this house before I moved in to help me decide whether to buy it. The door was already brown. Well, if you have documentation, submit it with an appeal. Brenda, this is harassment. Patricia is targeting me because I challenged her at the board meeting. I am just the office administrator, Mr. Larson. I process the paperwork." She hung up. I found the old real estate photos and submitted them with a written appeal, along with a formal harassment complaint. I detailed Patricia's threat after the board meeting and the pattern of bogus citations. This time, Susan, the board member who had supported me at the previous meeting, called me directly. "Ryan, I got your complaint. This is concerning. I am going to recommend we schedule a special session to address this, but I want you to know that some of us on the board are taking this seriously." "I appreciate that, Susan. I just want to live in my house without being constantly targeted." "I understand. Give me a few days to talk to the other board members." 3 days later, I received a notice that the door painting fine had been dismissed, and that Patricia was being formally reminded of proper complaint procedures. But I also heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Patricia was furious and had started attending HOA compliance review meetings in person, driving through the neighborhood every single day looking for violations. Sure enough, over the next month, fines in the neighborhood tripled. People were getting cited for things that had been ignored for years. Slightly overgrown bushes, faded house numbers, mailboxes with minor rust spots, cars parked on the street for more than 24 hours even though there was no assigned parking. The neighborhood was in an uproar. I started documenting everything. Every time I saw Patricia driving through the neighborhood with her camera, I made a note of the time and date. I talked to neighbors about their fines and started compiling a database of citations, showing the dramatic increase after the board meeting. In early May, I received yet another fine. This one was for excessive vehicle noise. Patricia claimed my truck was making loud engine sounds that violated the noise ordinance. The fine was $500, significantly higher than previous fines. This time, I did not even bother calling the HOA office. I went straight to a lawyer. I found an attorney in Phoenix named Mark Brennan who specialized in HOA disputes. His office was in a modern building in downtown Phoenix, and he had impressive credentials on his website, including several successful cases against HOA boards for harassment and improper enforcement. In our first meeting, I laid out everything: the original noise complaint, the board meeting, Patricia's threat, and the subsequent pattern of bogus fines. I showed him my documentation of neighborhood citations and the dramatic increase in enforcement. Mark listened carefully, taking notes. He was in his 50s with graying hair and the calm demeanor of someone who had seen it all before. "This is a pretty clear case of targeted harassment," he said when I finished. "The question is how you want to proceed. We can fight each fine individually, or we can take a broader approach and file a lawsuit against the HOA for harassment, emotional distress, and violation of Arizona HOA statutes." What would a lawsuit accomplish? A few things. First, it would put the HOA on notice that their behavior is illegal. Second, it would create a public record that could help other homeowners who are being similarly targeted. Third, if we win, you could recover damages including attorney fees, any fines you have paid, and compensation for the time and stress this has caused you. What are the downsides? Lawsuits are expensive and time-consuming. Even though HOA cases often include attorney fee provisions, you will need to pay upfront costs. It could take a year or more to resolve, and it will make living in your neighborhood more contentious. I thought about it. I was not someone who liked conflict, but Patricia had made it clear she was not going to stop. If I did not do something, she would continue to harass me and probably escalate. "Let us do it," I said. "File the lawsuit." Mark nodded. "I will draw up the paperwork. In the meantime, keep documenting everything. Every interaction, every fine, every time you see Patricia targeting you or other homeowners. The more evidence we have, the stronger our case." Over the next 2 weeks, Mark prepared a comprehensive lawsuit against the Meadowbrook Estates, HOA, and Patricia personally. The complaint alleged harassment, selective enforcement, violation of Arizona HOA statutes requiring fair and consistent rule enforcement, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We included all my documentation, statements from neighbors about the pattern of excessive fines, and expert testimony from Mark about HOA governance standards. The day the lawsuit was filed, I felt both relieved and anxious. I knew this was going to get ugly before it got better. Patricia received her copy of the lawsuit on a Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, I had a new fine taped to my door. This one claimed my grass was a 1/4 inch too tall. The fine was $250. I photographed the fine, measured my grass with a ruler to document it was within specification, and forwarded everything to Mark. "She is digging her own grave," Mark said when I called him. "This just proves the harassment claim. Keep documenting." The HOA's attorney responded to the lawsuit with a motion to dismiss, arguing that the HOA had the right to enforce its rules and that no harassment had occurred. But Mark had anticipated this and filed a detailed response with all our documentation, showing the pattern of selective enforcement and Patricia's explicit threat after the board meeting. In June, we had our first court hearing. It was a preliminary hearing in Maricopa County Superior Court to address the motion to dismiss. I took a day off work and met Mark at the courthouse in downtown Phoenix. The HOA was represented by a law firm that specialized in HOA defense. Their attorney was a sharp-dressed woman named Jennifer who argued forcefully that the HOA had every right to enforce its covenants, and that I was simply a disgruntled homeowner who did not want to follow the rules. Mark countered by presenting the evidence of targeted harassment, the increased fines throughout the neighborhood after I challenged Patricia, and the documentation of Patricia's threat. He also highlighted the fact that many of my citations were for violations that did not actually exist, like the door painting. The judge, a middle-aged woman named Sandra Martinez, listened carefully to both sides. When the attorneys finished their arguments, she leaned back in her chair. "I am not dismissing this case," she said. "There appears to be sufficient evidence of a pattern that warrants further examination, We will proceed to discovery. I expect both parties to cooperate fully." Patricia, who was sitting in the courtroom behind the HOA's attorney, looked livid. As we left the courthouse, Mark squeezed my shoulder. "That was a good outcome. Now the real work begins." Discovery meant both sides could request documents and information from each other. Mark immediately filed requests for all HOA enforcement records for the past 3 years, all communications between Patricia and other board members, and any policies or procedures regarding complaint investigation. The HOA tried to stall, claiming some of the requests were overly broad, but the judge ordered them to comply. When the documents finally arrived, they were revealing. The enforcement records showed that under Patricia's tenure as board president, fines had increased by 400%. But the increase was not evenly distributed. Certain homeowners, including me, had received a disproportionate number of citations. Meanwhile, other homeowners, including several who Mark discovered were personal friends of Patricia, had never received a single fine despite visible violations. Even more damning were the emails. In one exchange between Patricia and another board member, Patricia had written, "Ryan Larson is making me look bad. We need to find violations at his property to show him he cannot get away with challenging my authority." Another email, sent 2 days after the board meeting, said, "I drove past the Larson house 3 times today. Nothing yet, but I will keep looking." Mark was thrilled when he showed me these emails. "This is smoking gun evidence. She is explicitly admitting to targeting you." But things were about to get worse for Patricia. As part of discovery, Mark also subpoenaed the HOA's financial records. When he reviewed them, he found something suspicious. "Ryan, look at this," he said during one of our meetings, pointing to a series of transactions. "Patricia has been approving payments to a landscaping company called Desert Sun Landscaping. The HOA is paying them about $6,000 a month. But when I cross-reference the business registration, Desert Sun Landscaping is owned by Patricia's husband." I felt my stomach drop. "She is funneling HOA money to her own family. It looks that way. And there is no record of competitive bidding for the contract, which is required under Arizona law for HOA contracts over a certain amount. This could be embezzlement." Mark immediately filed an amended complaint, adding allegations of financial misconduct and breach of fiduciary duty. He also sent a formal notice to the other board members alerting them to the potential embezzlement. The response was swift. Within a week, the HOA board held an emergency meeting and voted to suspend Patricia as president pending an investigation. Susan, the board member who had been supportive of me, was appointed interim president. Susan called me personally. "Ryan, I had no idea about the landscaping contract. We are hiring a forensic accountant to review all the HOA finances. If Patricia has been stealing money, we will pursue criminal charges. I appreciate you taking this seriously. I am sorry you had to go through all this. Patricia should never have been allowed to run the HOA like her personal fiefdom." The forensic accountant's report came back 2 weeks later. It showed that over the past 4 years, Patricia had funneled approximately $280,000 in HOA funds to her husband's landscaping company. The contracts had been approved without competitive bidding, and the rates charged were significantly higher than market value. Additionally, the accountant found that Patricia had approved several other payments to companies owned by family members or friends, all without proper board oversight. This was no longer just a civil matter. Mark advised the HOA board to contact the Arizona Attorney General's office and the Phoenix Police Department. On a hot July morning, 2 detectives from the Phoenix Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit showed up at Patricia's house with a warrant. I watched from my living room window as they spent 3 hours inside, carrying out boxes of documents and computer equipment. Patricia was arrested that afternoon and charged with theft, fraud, and embezzlement. The local news picked up the story, running headlines about HOA president arrested for embezzling nearly $300,000. The arrest changed everything. The HOA board issued a formal apology to me and other homeowners who had been unfairly targeted. They dismissed all outstanding fines that Patricia had issued and announced a comprehensive review of enforcement procedures. Mark and I met with the new board to discuss a settlement. They offered to pay my attorney fees, compensate me for the time and stress of the lawsuit, and implement new governance policies to prevent future abuse. I accepted the settlement, which totaled $45,000 after attorney fees, but I was not done yet. I wanted to make sure this could not happen again. I worked with Susan and the other board members to draft new bylaws that included term limits for board officers, mandatory financial audits, competitive bidding requirements for all contracts, and a formal complaint process with checks and balances to prevent selective enforcement. We also rewrote the noise ordinance to require actual decibel measurements for any citation, and we established limits for the HOA's own equipment. The new landscaping company, selected through a proper bidding process, was required to use quieter electric equipment during restricted hours. Patricia's criminal case moved through the court system over the following months. Her attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecution was not interested in going easy. In October, Patricia pleaded guilty to theft and fraud charges. She was sentenced to 4 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution of $280,000 to the HOA. The sentencing hearing was held in the same courthouse where my civil case had been heard. I attended, sitting in the back of the courtroom. When the judge read the sentence, Patricia broke down crying, begging for leniency. But Judge Martinez was unmoved. "You held a position of trust in your community," the judge said sternly. "You were supposed to be looking out for your neighbors, not stealing from them and using your position to harass people who challenged you. Your behavior was disgraceful, and the sentence reflects the severity of your crimes." As Patricia was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, she glanced back at the gallery. Our eyes met for just a moment, and I saw nothing but bitter resentment in her expression. She still did not think she had done anything wrong. After the sentencing, several news outlets interviewed me about the case. I kept my comments measured, focusing on the importance of HOA accountability and the need for proper oversight of community associations. "HOAs serve an important function," I told one reporter. "But they need checks and balances just like any other organization with power over people's lives. No one should be able to use their position to target people they do not like or to enrich themselves at their neighbor's expense." The story resonated. I started getting calls and emails from people all over Arizona and even other states who had similar experiences with abusive HOA boards. I realized this was a much bigger problem than just my neighborhood. I decided to do something about it. Using part of the settlement money, I started a website and advocacy organization called HOA Accountability Arizona. The site provided resources for homeowners dealing with HOA disputes, information about legal rights, and a forum where people could share their experiences and advice. I also started working with state legislators to strengthen HOA oversight laws in Arizona. I testified before a legislative committee about my experience and the systemic problems with HOA governance. My testimony, along with advocacy from other homeowners and organizations, helped lead to new legislation requiring regular financial audits for all HOAs, term limits for board officers, and stricter penalties for board members who abuse their authority. Back in Meadowbrook Estates, life gradually returned to normal. Susan served as HOA president for 2 years, implementing all the reforms we had discussed. Enforcement became fair and consistent. Fines dropped to reasonable levels and were only issued for legitimate violations. The new landscaping company did a better job and cost 40% less than what Patricia's husband had been charging. I finally felt like I could relax in my own home. I went back to my woodworking projects on weekends, using my air compressor without fear of harassment. My neighbors were friendlier, no longer worried about arbitrary fines for minor infractions. One Saturday afternoon in December, about 18 months after the whole ordeal began, I was in my garage working on a bookshelf when Tom stopped by. "Hey Ryan, I wanted to thank you again for everything you did. This neighborhood is so much better now." "I appreciate that, Tom. I just did what needed to be done." "It was more than that. You stood up when a lot of people were too scared to say anything." My wife and I were talking about moving because of all the stress. Now we are actually happy here again. After Tom left, I stood in my garage looking at my partially completed bookshelf. The air compressor hummed quietly in the corner, well below any noise ordinance threshold. Everything was peaceful. I thought about how close I had come to just paying that first fine and moving on. It would have been easier in the short term, but Patricia would have continued her harassment, and eventually, she probably would have driven me out of my home. Instead, by standing up and insisting on accountability, I had not only protected myself but helped reform an entire system. The satisfaction I felt was deeper than just winning a legal case. It was about proving that regular people could fight back against abuse of power, even in something as mundane as a homeowners association. My phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from someone in Texas who had found my HOA accountability website. They were dealing with a board president who was trying to fine them for political signs in their yard, which was protected by state law. They were asking for advice. I sat down and started typing a response, sharing what I had learned about documentation, knowing your rights, and not being afraid to challenge authority when it was wrong. As I wrote, I realized this had become more than just my personal story. It was a blueprint for how to handle similar situations. The bookshelf could wait. This was more important. Over the next few hours, I answered emails, updated the website with new resources, and worked on a guide for homeowners dealing with noise complaints. I included my decibel testing methodology, recommendations for sound level meters, and a template for documenting measurements. As evening fell, I finally returned to the bookshelf project. I turned on my air compressor, and it started with its characteristic quiet hum. I smiled, thinking about how a simple noise complaint had led to all of this. The bookshelf came together nicely over the next few weeks. It was made from walnut, with clean lines and hand-cut dovetail joints. When it was finished, I placed it in my living room and filled it with books about Arizona law, HOA governance, and advocacy. The story of my fight with Patricia had become something of a legend in Phoenix HOA circles. I occasionally got invited to speak at community meetings or to consult with homeowners who were dealing with similar issues. I always said yes, because I knew how isolating and frustrating it could be to feel powerless against an HOA board. In February, almost 2 years after the original noise complaint, I was invited to speak at an Arizona State Bar Association seminar on HOA law. Attorneys from around the state attended, including Mark, who had become a friend. I told my story from the beginning: the bogus fine, the decibel testing, the escalating harassment, and the eventual discovery of embezzlement. But I focused on the lessons learned and the systemic changes that resulted. "The key thing I want you to take away," I told the attorneys, "is that documentation is everything. I could have lost my case if I had not measured the actual noise levels and gathered evidence of Patricia's targeting. Homeowners need to know their rights, document everything, and not be afraid to stand up for themselves." After the seminar, several attorneys came up to talk to me. One told me about a case she was working on where an HOA president was using citation powers to intimidate a board member who disagreed with him. Another described a situation where an HOA was selectively enforcing architectural rules based on personal relationships. The problems were everywhere, I realized. Patricia was not unique. The power dynamics of HOA boards attracted people who enjoyed control, and sometimes those people abused that power. But with the right tools and knowledge, homeowners could fight back. That spring, Susan announced she would not seek re-election as HOA president. She had accomplished what she set out to do, reforming the governance structure and restoring trust in the board. A new president was elected, a retired accountant named David who had a reputation for fairness and attention to detail. I was invited to the first board meeting under the new administration. David started by thanking me publicly for my role in reforming the HOA. "What Ryan did took courage," David said. "He could have just moved or paid the fines to avoid conflict. Instead, he stood up for what was right, and now we have a stronger, fairer community because of it. I hope everyone remembers that as we move forward." The room applauded, and I felt a lump in my throat. It had been a long, difficult journey, but we had reached a good place. As I drove home that evening, I passed the house where Patricia used to live. It had been sold to pay part of the restitution she owed. A young family lived there now, with 2 small children who played in the front yard. I wondered if they knew the history of the house, or if they just saw it as a fresh start. For me, Meadowbrook Estates had become both a home and a symbol. It represented what could go wrong when power went unchecked, but also what could be achieved when people stood up for accountability and fairness. My air compressor still sat in my garage, quiet unless I was using it for a project. The sound level meter I had rented was long since returned, but I had kept all the documentation from my testing. Sometimes I looked at those photos and charts, remembering how a simple decibel measurement had started everything. The HOA accountability website continued to grow. I added a section specifically about noise complaints, detailing how to properly measure sound levels and what to do if an HOA issued a citation without proper documentation. The page became one of the most visited sections of the site. I also worked with Mark to create a legal resource guide for Arizona homeowners, outlining their rights under state HOA law and providing templates for common legal documents like appeals and complaints. We made everything available for free, wanting to ensure that any homeowner could access the information regardless of their financial situation. In June, I received an email that made everything feel worthwhile. It was from a woman in Tucson who had been targeted by her HOA president for parking a work van in her driveway. Using the resources from my website, she had documented the selective enforcement, challenged the fine, and ultimately got it dismissed. The HOA president, embarrassed by the challenge, had resigned. "Your story gave me the courage to fight back," she wrote. "I thought I was alone, but knowing someone else had gone through this and one made all the difference. Thank you." I read that email 3 times, feeling a profound sense of purpose. This was bigger than just my personal vindication. It was about empowering people to stand up for themselves and creating a culture of accountability. That summer, I testified before another legislative committee, this time about a proposed bill that would require HOA boards to carry errors and omissions insurance. The insurance would protect homeowners if board members made mistakes or engaged in misconduct. Insurance creates accountability, I told the committee. If an HOA board knows their actions could trigger an insurance claim, they will be more careful about following proper procedures. And if they do not follow procedures, homeowners will have recourse beyond just suing the HOA. The bill passed with bipartisan support and was signed into law by the governor in August. It was a small victory, but it represented real progress in HOA reform. As fall arrived, I found myself reflecting on how much my life had changed in 2 years. I had gone from being an engineer who just wanted to work on woodworking projects in peace to being an advocate for HOA reform. It was not a path I had chosen deliberately, but it felt right. My relationship with my neighbors had also deepened. We had been through something difficult together, and it created bonds that went beyond just living on the same street. People looked out for each other now. When someone received a fine, others would check to make sure it was legitimate. If the HOA wanted to make major decisions, homeowners actually showed up to meetings to be informed and engaged. That was perhaps the biggest change. Patricia's abuse had inadvertently created a more active, involved community. People no longer took the HOA for granted or assumed board members were acting in good faith. There was healthy skepticism and oversight. In October, I got a call from a producer at a national news program. They had heard about my story and wanted to do a segment on HOA abuse for their investigative journalism show. I agreed, thinking it would be a good opportunity to raise awareness on a larger platform. The interview was filmed at my house in Phoenix. The producer asked me to walk through what had happened, starting with the first noise complaint. I showed them my garage, my air compressor, and explained the decibel testing process. I talked about Patricia's harassment and the eventual discovery of embezzlement. "What do you think motivates someone like Patricia?" the interviewer asked. I thought carefully before answering. "I think some people are attracted to positions of authority because they enjoy control over others. In an HOA, you have real power over people's homes and lives, but often there is not much oversight. That combination can bring out the worst in people who are inclined toward that behavior. You think this is a widespread problem? Based on the emails I get through my website, yes. I hear from people all over the country dealing with abusive HOA boards. The details vary, but the pattern is often the same: selective enforcement, retaliation against people who challenge the board, and sometimes financial misconduct. What should homeowners do if they find themselves in a similar situation? Document everything. Know your rights. Do not be afraid to challenge unlawful or unfair decisions, and if necessary, get legal help. HOA boards are not above the law, even though they sometimes act like they are. The segment aired in November and generated a huge response. My website traffic exploded, and I received hundreds of emails from people sharing their own HOA horror stories. Many asked for advice, and I did my best to respond to everyone. The publicity also caught the attention of several national homeowner advocacy organizations. They reached out about collaborating on legislative efforts and creating resources that could be used in multiple states. I agreed, excited about the possibility of having a broader impact. As the year drew to a close, I found myself thinking about New Year's resolutions. Usually, I focused on personal goals like fitness or learning new skills. But this year, I wanted to commit to continuing the advocacy work. I decided to write a book about my experience and what I had learned about HOA governance and homeowner rights. It would not be a legal treatise, but rather a practical guide that any homeowner could use. I started outlining chapters and gathering research. Writing the book became my winter project. On cold evenings, I would sit at my kitchen table with my laptop, working through chapters on topics like understanding HOA bylaws, effective communication with board members, documenting violations, and when to seek legal help. I included my own story as a case study, but also incorporated stories from other homeowners who had fought back against abusive HOAs. By March, I had a complete draft. Mark agreed to review the legal sections to make sure everything was accurate. Susan read it from a board member's perspective, offering insights about what good HOA governance looked like. Several homeowners who had contacted me through the website also read chapters and provided feedback. The final manuscript was stronger for all the input. I found a publisher who specialized in consumer advocacy books, and they were enthusiastic about the project. The book was scheduled for publication in the fall. As spring arrived in Phoenix, bringing warm days and blooming desert flowers, I finally felt like I had closed the chapter on the Patricia saga. She was in prison, the HOA was functioning properly, and I had turned a negative experience into something positive. But there was one more piece of closure I needed. I decided to donate the settlement money I had received to a cause that would help other homeowners. After researching various options, I established a legal defense fund through my HOA accountability organization. The fund would provide grants to homeowners who needed legal help fighting abusive HOAs, but could not afford attorney fees. The first grant went to a single mother in Scottsdale, who was being fined by her HOA for having a small vegetable garden in her backyard. The HOA claimed it violated landscaping rules, even though she was growing food to feed her children. With the grant, she was able to hire an attorney who successfully argued that Arizona's urban agriculture laws protected her right to grow food on her property. The fine was dismissed. That felt right. Taking the money, Patricia had indirectly cost the HOA through her harassment, and using it to help other people fight similar battles created a sense of justice that went beyond just legal victory. In May, almost 3 years after the original noise complaint, I was working in my garage on a Saturday afternoon when Tom stopped by again. "I was thinking about something," Tom said, leaning against my workbench. "Do you ever regret not just paying that first fine and avoiding all the hassle?" I set down the chisel I was using and considered the question. "No," I said finally. "If I had paid it, Patricia would have kept targeting me and others. The embezzlement would have continued. Nothing would have changed." Sure, it was stressful and time-consuming to fight it, but look at what came out of it. We have a better community, better laws, and I am helping people all over the state. That is worth the hassle. Tom nodded thoughtfully. "You are right. It is just hard to see that in the moment when you are in the middle of it." "That is true. But sometimes doing the right thing is hard. That does not make it less worth doing." After Tom left, I turned off my power tools and walked outside. The afternoon sun was warm on my face as I looked around my neighborhood. Kids were playing basketball in a driveway down the street. A couple was walking their dog. Someone was washing their car. Normal, peaceful suburban life. This was what an HOA should enable. A pleasant community where people could live their lives without unnecessary interference. Not a place where one person's power trip made everyone else miserable. I pulled out my phone and opened the HOA accountability website. There were 3 new messages in the contact form. I sat down on my front steps and started reading and responding to them, offering advice and encouragement to strangers who were facing their own HOA battles. The sun was setting over the Phoenix skyline, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and pink. My air compressor sat quiet in the garage behind me. Somewhere across town, Patricia was in a prison cell, probably still bitter about how everything had played out. And across Arizona and beyond, homeowners were learning that they did not have to accept abuse from their HOAs, that they had rights and recourse. It had all started with a simple noise complaint and a decibel test that proved the HOA's own lawn mowers were louder than anything I owned. From that small act of gathering objective evidence had grown a movement toward accountability and reform. Looking back, I realized that the air compressor noise complaint was never really about noise at all. It was about power and control, and what happens when someone abuses a position of authority. My decision to fight back with facts and documentation had not only vindicated me, but had exposed a much larger problem and helped create solutions. As darkness fell and the streetlights came on, I headed back inside. There was more work to do, more homeowners to help, more reforms to advocate for. But tonight, I could rest knowing that the fight had been worth it, that justice had been served, and that my community was better for the struggle we had been through. The bookshelf I had built sat against the wall, filled with law books and advocacy materials. My laptop was on the kitchen table, ready for the next email from someone who needed help. And in the garage, my woodworking equipment waited for the next weekend project. Everything was exactly as it should be. I had fought the HOA and won, but more importantly, I had helped change a system that needed changing. That was something no fine could ever take away.